Auf der Schiffsreise lag ich da in Ketten.
Ja.
Als ich in Amerika ankam, wurde ich da in Ketten zur Schau gestellt.
Ja.
Bin ich die Geschichte des Negers in Amerika?
Nein.
Also dann muss ich King Kong sein.
Ah.
In March of 2021, Legendary Pictures released Godzilla vs. Kong. It's a big, dumb, really fun monster movie. A giant monkey punches a giant dinosaur in the face. Everybody's having a good time. But when the trailer came out back in January, there was one detail in particular that really made me sit up and take notice. So if you've seen this movie already, you'll know that Kong has a human companion named Gia, a little girl from Skull Island, which is the same fictional island that Kong comes from. And she's important because she's the only person he'll listen to. And this is actually kind of huge. Godzilla vs. Kong is the 9th live-action feature film to star King Kong, 11th if you count those two lost films that were made in Japan in the 30s. But this is the first film where one of the Skull Islanders is even given a name, much less made a main character. So the question I want to ask with this video essay is, A, why is this important? And B, why has it taken almost 90 years to get here? The original King Kong is one of the most iconic films of all time. Even if you've never seen it, you've probably seen one of the countless pop culture parodies out there. It's also very, very racist. And okay, so before we go any further, I'm going to be discussing these films in the context of racism and colonialism, and how certain aspects of these films are tied in with those ways of thinking, and how embedded they were and still are in Hollywood, and how it portrays indigenous peoples. None of this is to say that King Kong isn't still a great film, because it is. It's a masterpiece. It's just that those films are products of a certain time. That's the context in which they were made, and being aware of that is a part of how we understand them and engage with them. And look, just don't make me turn off the comments on this thing, okay? Play nice. So before we proceed, I just want to lay out a few terms that I'll be using throughout this video essay. First off, imperialism and colonialism. Lisa Tahiwai-Smith defines imperialism as a country's economic and military expansion of influence, and colonialism as one country's physical domination of another one. Another one I'm going to be using a lot is post-colonial, which is critical literary work that studies the legacy and after effects of colonialism. According to some people, Smith is very critical of any approach to studying colonialism that leaves out the perspectives of the people who are actually affected by it. So this essay is going to run with a definition of post-colonialism as centering the perspectives of indigenous peoples as a reaction to and a departure from colonialist narratives. I'm also going to refer a lot to the term other and to the terms man one and man two. The other is a term that comes up a lot in critical theory, especially when it comes to race. Edward Said discusses this a lot in his book Orientalism, and what it boils down to is a text designating certain people, races or cultures as not like us being the presumed white audience. Anytime you see an image of the painted spear-wielding quote-unquote savage, or any news report that tells you a certain culture is backwards and dangerous and a threat to our way of life, that's the idea of the other right there. The radical Jamaican scholar Sylvia Wynter, who gave us the man one, man two idea, was working along kind of similar lines. In her essay Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, and she describes this idea as going back to the religious notion of Adam and Eve and the apple and the fall, and the notion of people being, quote, saved by religion. The idea of the enlightened, virtuous man versus the base, vulgar man who's a slave to his urges. And after the Enlightenment and Darwin and all of that, we tend to think that we broke away from that whole religious way of thinking. But Winter argues that all we really did was adapt it from saved versus unsaved to the civilized versus the uncivilized. And from that you get the whole idea put about by the British Empire, among others, that what they were doing was just and right and proper because they were civilizing all those, quote, ignorant savages. And actually, before I go any further, I'm going to have to refer a lot to terms like savage and civilized, even though those aren't terms I necessarily agree with, but it's the mode of thinking that we're going to be talking about. So anytime I use a term like that, just imagine there are massive air quotes around it. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with King Kong?
Otarave Rama Kong.
So there are three versions of the classic King Kong narrative. There's the original from 1933, the 1976 version by Dino De Laurentiis, and the 2005 film by Peter Jackson. And there are also various sequels, adaptations, TV series, comics, video games, and a Broadway show, but I'd like to get this essay out sometime prior to the heat death of the universe, so I'm going to be sticking to the core Hollywood versions of the story. So each of these three films tells essentially the same story. A ship arrives on an uncharted island where the natives kidnap our blonde heroine, Anne Darrow, and offer her as a sacrifice to their god, a giant ape called Kong. A rescue party, including director Carl Denham and leading man Jack Driscoll, sets out to save her, and in the process they subdue Kong and decide to take him back to New York. Kong is displayed in chains, breaks free, goes on a rampage, and is finally killed. Probably the most famous line from the original is the character Carl Denham standing over Kong's body and saying, "It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast." Now this plot shares a lot of similarities with films like The Creature from the Black Lagoon, where white explorers will enter the wilderness and encounter a beastly creature that's explicitly a threat to a white woman, and the undertones there are, well, they're basically just tones. C.T. Manlove, in an essay called An Image of Africa, Representations of Modern Colonialism in Peter Jackson's King Kong, talks a lot about producer Marion C. Cooper's own start in documentary filmmaking in the savage parts of the world, and how King Kong is mired in early 20th century ideas of Africa as the dark continent, the antithesis of civilization. Even the name Kong is derived from the word Congo. This is a colonialist film. It's just right there on the face of it. Now, if we're going to be talking about the Skull Islanders, one thing we have to address is the fact that they're not based on any real ethnic group, but in a way this kind of makes them every tribal indigenous society. They're cobbled together from Hollywood stereotypes of North African and Pacific Island peoples. The whole general idea of this hostile, jabbering, spear-waving native with a capital N. This is what Hollywood in the 1930s thought of all those real tribal societies, and let's be honest, it didn't really bother differentiating between them that much. It's the idea of the other, of Winter's Man 2. They barely exist as characters in these stories, they're just there to be a counterpoint to what we think of as the safety of civilization. And now we need to detour just for a minute to talk about Kong himself, because in the original film, he is also very heavily racially coded. I mean, look at this image, and then this one. One is a publicity still for the original King Kong, and the other is a World War I propaganda poster specifically designed to get people hyped out to go and kill foreigners because they're supposedly a threat to white women. In an essay called Not Yet Human, Goff, Eberhardt, Williams, and Jackson talk about Kong in relation to this not uncommon representation of people of colour, especially people of African descent as, and I'm quoting from the essay here, aggressive, dim, hypersexual, and most tellingly, ape-like. It's the idea of social Darwinism, the notion that people of colour, again especially people of African descent, are less evolved. As Goff and company put it, the film's character of blackness is not a man, it's an ape. Beauty was white, the beast was black. It's sort of the ultimate extension of Winter's Man 1, Man 2 model, what she called the human other, a base, vulgar perversion of man closer to beast than human being. And by association with Kong, some of them even wear big furry arm coverings imitating him, the Skull Islanders are positioned very much toward the beast end of that spectrum. This is something that's largely absent from later versions of Kong himself. He's given a lot more about sympathy in the various remakes. His appearance is less anthropomorphic, so it kind of sidesteps this racial coding. But as far as the original film and how that's coded, look, let's cut the fancy talk here. Kong in this movie is a metaphor for white America's fears about aggressive black male sexuality. The fear of black men making off with white women was not a rare one in the 1930s, and well, I wish I could say it was a rare one today, but yeah. Saying that there's racism and colonialism in the original King Kong is understating it. It's cut wholesale from that cloth. Again, it's still a great movie, and it deserves its reputation as a classic, but this is the context in which it exists. And that raises kind of an interesting question. Can different iterations of that same story ever be free of those associations? Or are they just too deeply tied in with its very existence? Can a colonialist story ever be turned into something post-colonial? These remakes of the original story give us a pretty unique opportunity in Hollywood. By retelling the same narrative over multiple generations, it kind of creates this litmus test to see how Hollywood represents indigenous peoples across time. So the first remake by Dino De Laurentiis in 1976 is one that I'm not honestly going to dwell on for too long because it doesn't add all that much. There's a sort of commentary on capitalism and the way it updates the story. Our replacement for Carl Denham is much more of a villain and works for an oil company that intends to split mine Skull Island. And I do like how he wears this cowboy hat that's sort of a symbol of his showman-like personality and American excess, and then that's the only thing left of him after Kong crushes him underfoot. And if you view the film as a criticism of capitalism, it's kind of fitting that Kong's last stand happens on top of the World Trade Center instead of the Empire State Building. It's much more of a tragedy in this version. It's the story of a wonder of nature being destroyed by corporate greed. In terms of how the Skull Islanders are presented, again, it's all very stereotypical, like the scene where they try to buy the armed arrow substitute from the crew in exchange for 4 native women, and there we have white femininity being upheld as the standard of beauty, which is very, very Hollywood. And by presenting them as a contrast to the capitalist American world the film criticizes, there are some interesting implications brought up there, but I want to talk about that later, because this is where we get to Peter Jackson's version, and this is where it gets interesting. So the 2005 film has a complicated relationship with the original. It's mostly a very padded retelling of the original story, again set in 1933, but it uses the fact that it's a period piece to provide commentary not only of the original film, but of 1930s Hollywood. There's a really fascinating scene where we get to the part of the story where Kong has been chained up and is being shown on Broadway. In this version, our sympathy is a lot more with Kong. We've bonded with him all the way through the film, just like Anne has. And as the camera lingers on him looking miserable, Carl Denham gives a very skewed account of what happens on the island. Then a bunch of actors in blackface appear on the stage, playing out Denham's version of events, dressed just like the natives from the original film. What the movie is telling us here is pretty clear, that this was how Hollywood portrayed indigenous peoples in the 30s, that it was false, just like the rest of Denham's account, and that it was morally wrong, just like Kong's capture and humiliation. The problem is that earlier on, when we see the Skull Islanders in the story proper, this movie really isn't any better than the original in that regard. In fact, it's kind of worse. Seriously, look at these two images. One is the Skull Islander, the other is an orc from one of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, and you see the problem here. And the orcs and their origins are also a whole racial thing, but that's sort of a video in itself. And this gets really weird when you think about how the film quotes from the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So, quick detour to talk about that, I guess, because that's going to come up later. Heart of Darkness is a novel that follows Marlowe, a sailor who makes an upriver journey in an unspecified African country to capture or kill a renegade soldier named Colonel Kurtz, who's set himself up as a demigod among the natives. To this day, it's a very controversial book. Some people hail it as a condemnation of British imperialism, and others criticizing it for fully buying into the whole dark continent idea, framing Africa as the antithesis of civilization, and reducing the struggles and suffering of its people to a backdrop to the white character's moral realization. Again, we're going to discuss that later as well. For my money, it's a book that has good intentions, but it doesn't think to question its own assumptions about other countries and indigenous peoples, so it ends up mired in the very racism and colonialism that it's trying to criticize. Jackson's version of Kong quotes from the book as the crew arrives from the island and uses it to parallel the crew's journey and the one in Heart of Darkness, and ironically it ends up falling into the exact same trap that the book does. The fact is, the King Kong narrative hinges on the idea of the other, of using a non-white tribal society explicitly as a threat to the white characters, specifically to white women. And no amount of look how far we've come reflection is going to change that when you're still telling the same story. So what happens when you break with that story entirely?
This is his home. We're just guests here. Well, you don't go into someone's house and start dropping bombs unless you're picking a fight.
Fast forward to 2017, and Kong Skull Island has ditched the original storyline entirely. Kong is now the straight-up hero of the story, which follows a joint military-scientific expedition that runs afoul of Kong and inadvertently awakens a race of carnivorous reptiles from beneath the island. From the moment Kong appears on the horizon and starts swatting down helicopters, it's pretty clear that this is not your granddad's King Kong. And there are two facets of this film that I really want to focus on. One is Lieutenant Packard, played by Samuel L. Jackson, a military officer who becomes obsessed with killing Kong, and the other is the Iwi, which is what this film calls the Skull Islanders. The film uses Packard to comment on the Vietnam War. We're introduced to him during the US's withdrawal from the conflict as he sadly ruminates over everything that's been lost and how little was achieved. Throughout the film, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that he's channeled all his anger and frustration from the war into trying to kill Kong to avenge his men. There's also this scene right here.
Took it off a farmer fighting for the NVA. He surrendered right after we leveled his village. He was 50 years old, said he never even seen a gun until we showed up. Sometimes an enemy doesn't exist till you go looking for one.
Where the commentary on the Vietnam War is pretty explicit. And before we can go any further with this, we need to talk about Apocalypse Now, which is going to bring us back to Heart of Darkness again, because while Apocalypse Now is not technically an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, according to Francis Ford Coppola, it's an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, just transplanted to the Vietnam War and criticizing American interventionism rather than British imperialism. And like Heart of Darkness, the plot relies in othering the indigenous people of its setting to make its point. Kurtz and his renegade soldiers paint themselves in the tribal style explicitly in response to the hypocrisy of the American government. Now, the film presents Kurtz as a character who has a point about the horrors of war and what it means to experience it firsthand, but whether he's really the bad guy isn't what we're talking about right now. My point is that the use of tribal aesthetics codes them as being antithetical to the civilized Western world. Just like Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now is making a point about Western society and imperialism by setting it against an other. Side note, M.J. Lacey goes into this in much more detail in another really good essay called Cinema, War and Moral Anxiety. So Kong Skull Island, like I said, has a lot of Apocalypse Now references. Two of the lead characters are named after characters from the original book. Another is named after the author. And look at this shot right here compared to the poster. And like Apocalypse Now, its point about the Vietnam War hinges on using an indigenous society as a counterpoint to it. We're introduced to the Iwi via Hank Marlowe, get it, Marlowe, who's a World War II pilot who's been stranded on the island for years. This is the first one of these films where the Skull Islanders aren't antagonists, and they're given a lot more development this time around, so credit where it's due. Marlowe is the lens through which we see them. He shows respect for their customs, so the audience is inclined to do the same. They're described as having no personal property and being, and I quote, past all that. And this is where we come to the issues that Skull Island kind of stumbles into, beginning with the idea of the noble savage. The noble savage is a figure that appears in literature as far back as the 17th century, and is generally understood to be a stock character presented as innocent and righteous, because they're uncorrupted by the flaws of civilized society. It's not uncommon to see this trope applied to real-world ethnic groups, like the portrayals of Native Americans in Pocahontas or Dances with Wolves, but you see it a lot with fictional races too, like the Na'vi from Avatar, who basically are the Native Americans in Dances with Wolves. It's something that appears alongside another narrative trope a lot of the time, and that's the idea of the white savior. This is a white character who rescues a person of color, or sometimes a whole civilization, from danger or misery from which they are for some reason unable to extract themselves. The Last Samurai, The Blind Side, Dances with Wolves, and Skull Island. It's the other again. It's Winter's Man 1, Man 2 again, just wearing a different face. The heroes of Skull Island are mostly white castaways. The iwi are there basically just to provide exposition, most of which comes via Marlowe anyway, to be a counterpoint to Packard's mission of revenge, and to be pretty much entirely passive in the face of danger to the island. There are no named or individualized characters among the iwi. They're a plot device, like Heart of Darkness did with Africa and Apocalypse Now does with Vietnam. Kong Skull Island takes place in their home, but it's not their story. Enter Gia. So, spoilers for Godzilla vs. Kong from this point on. We learn that the iwi have been killed off screen by a storm, and the only survivor is Gia, a young deaf girl who communicates with Kong by sign language. Kong's side of the plot involves a group of scientists led by Gia's adoptive mother, Dr. Eileen Andrews, trying to find Kong a suitable habitat, only to cross paths with Godzilla. Then you have a big fight on top of an aircraft carrier and stuff blows up and Kong gets this big axe and they team up and fight Mechagodzilla and it's awesome. And I'm getting off topic. Question is, does Gia's role in this film represent a shift from the colonialism and general iffiness of the previous films? And the answer is, yeah, not really. Gia isn't an especially deep or complex character, but I find it hard to criticize the film for giving her a lack of depth when no one in the movie really fares any better. And a few critics even singled out actress Kaylee Hottle as one of the highlights of the film. She's not entirely rid of the problems that affected the previous film. She has this almost preternatural relationship with Kong, and she's a counterpoint to the scientists and executives who just see him as a big dumb beast. So the noble savage trope is kind of in full swing there. And with her relationship to Eileen, there's a hint of the white savior trope in there as well, since she spends the majority of the film under the protection of a white character. And Eileen is the one who relates all the iwi beliefs surrounding Kong. What's interesting about this, though, is that those two tropes kind of mitigate each other in this film. Because the rational white expert vouches for Gia's bond with Kong, it gives Gia's understanding some legitimacy and kind of lessens the othering of her character. But at the same time, there's no getting away from the fact that we only see Gia from the outside. The story is never being told from her perspective, and with the rest of the iwi conveniently killed off screen, Gia is essentially divorced from her culture. There's one more thing I want to talk about with regard to this film, and that's Monarch. Monarch is a fictional quasi-military organization that appears in this and the previous Godzilla movies by Legendary Studios, and they're the ones trying to protect Kong. Their presence on the island is portrayed as wholly benevolent, aside from one side comment by Andrews about how our meddling destroyed Kong's natural habitat. In this case, American intervention is, at worst, succeeding at cleaning up the messes it made before, and at best is actively benign. So, considering the legacy of these films, that's kind of a yikes. Gia is my favourite character in Godzilla vs. Kong, who isn't Godzilla or Kong. She's definitely the most interesting non-monster punching part of the film, but she can't help but exist within the context of the previous versions of King Kong. And with her cultural perspective being essentially co-opted by the white lead, she can't bring an indigenous perspective to the story. If we just saw more of the story from her perspective, or how she feels about being the last of an extinct people, that would have gone a long way. But there's nothing in Godzilla vs. Kong that can be considered reframing the story to put that perspective at the centre. But she does matter, and she has the potential to matter enormously. And this is why. This new batch of King Kong films makes it pretty clear that the days of retreading the original narrative are done. The question is whether future films will address the colonialist legacy behind them or just try to remove it. Removing the Skull Islanders entirely wouldn't fix the problem here. It would just be sweeping it under the rug, and let's be honest, it wouldn't really be King Kong without them. Future King Kong films will exist in the context of the previous ones. That's just how film franchises work. A post-colonial King Kong film would have to address those problems and put the Skull Islanders at the center of the narrative, not just a dangerous other or a backdrop for the white heroes. Gia's role in Godzilla vs. Kong being what it is can't really do this. But what it does do is open a door for indigenous characters in these films as individuals rather than cobbled together stereotypes. Future King Kong adaptations now have an opening to subvert what's probably one of the most pervasive colonialist narratives in Hollywood. And I don't think I need to tell you that a King Kong film that puts the indigenous characters front and center would be a pretty big deal. That post-colonial Kong film hasn't materialized yet, but it's closer than it's ever been. With the box office success of this latest film, there's no reason to suppose we've seen the last of Kong or of the Skull Islanders. One day we will return to Skull Island and to Kong and to its people, and maybe next time it'll be their story. Okay, thanks for watching my first ever video essay. This was adapted from a paper I wrote for my master's degree, and it was a topic that I found really fascinating to research and write about. I'm hoping to do more of these video essays about films and writing and storytelling and the ideas behind them, and I'm really excited to try and grow this channel. So if you enjoyed the video, then like, share and subscribe for more.